Ever walked outside, looked at your mailbox, and thought, well, someone definitely tried to murder that? I did. Mine was splintered across the Arizona dirt like a crime scene from a low-budget western, and the only witness was my HOA president, grinning like she just got promoted to sheriff of Crazy Town. That box wasn't just wood and paint, it was history, heart, and the last thing my late wife built with me. But apparently, it clashed with Paige Whitlow's vision of neighborhood perfection. Bad news for her, I don't scare easy, and I sure don't quit. Ever dealt with an HOA tyrant? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your war stories. The thing about Dustwood Ranch Estates is that it used to be actual ranch land before some developer chopped it up into 23 cookie-cutter lots back in 2021. This house, built by a real rancher in '78. Only one still standing. I'm the only one who kept the original ranch-style house. Everybody else went with those white colonial McMansions that look like they belong in Connecticut, not the middle of the Sonoran Desert, where summer temperatures regularly hit 120 degrees. My place has character, with weathered cedar siding that's turned silver gray in the desert sun, a wraparound porch with hand-carved posts that Melissa and I installed ourselves, and a metal roof that sounds like distant thunder when the monsoon rains finally arrive each July. The red dirt stretches out toward the Superstition Mountains in every direction, dotted with 100-year-old saguaro cacti and ancient Palo Verde trees that have survived droughts, floods, and now suburban development. That mailbox wasn't just any mailbox. It was made from a piece of red oak that had originally been our very first sign at Gaines Drive-In forever, back when we opened in 2004 with nothing but a borrowed projector and enough foolish optimism to think we could make a living showing movies under the stars. Melissa mixed that crimson red to match Arizona sunsets, painted by lamplight with hands that never rushed. The wood had weathered and faded over the years, taking on the silvery patina that only comes from decades of desert sun and wind. But you could still read every letter if you knew what to look for. Every time I walked out to get the mail, I could hear Melissa's laugh echoing across the desert, smell the buttered popcorn from our concession stand, remember what it felt like when we had dreams bigger than just surviving day to day. She used to stand beside that mailbox every morning, watching the sun rise, paint the mountains purple and gold while she planned out the day's activities. Russell, she'd say, we're going to make this place special. People are going to remember what it felt like to fall in love with movies again. And for 15 years, that's exactly what we did. Until COVID-19 killed the drive-in business and pancreatic cancer took Melissa just 18 months later. I knelt down in the already blazing heat. It was only 7 in the morning, but the temperature was already climbing toward 100 degrees, and started picking up the pieces of my past. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the desert sun. The wood was splintered beyond repair, split down the grain in a way that told me this wasn't accidental damage from a careless delivery driver. These were deliberate breaks, the kind of destruction that comes from high-speed impact with something heavy and determined. I could see tire tracks in the caliche dirt, fresh impressions from something with expensive tires and all-wheel drive, definitely not a UPS truck or a mail delivery vehicle. As I gathered the broken pieces of the only physical reminder I had left of my life with Melissa, I found a small piece of chrome-plated plastic stuck in one of the bigger chunks of oak. It was curved and had part of a BMW logo on it, the kind of expensive trim piece that costs $300 to replace at the dealership. I held it up to the morning light, and that's when I heard Paige's voice, floating across the desert air like a buzzard circling overhead, all fake sweetness and calculated concern. She was walking toward me in her designer workout clothes, the kind of outfit that costs more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Her oversized sun hat casting a shadow that probably provided more relief than the air conditioning in most people's cars. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail that didn't have a single strand out of place despite the morning heat, and her makeup looked like she'd just walked out of a magazine photo shoot instead of a house in the middle of the Arizona desert. "Oh, Russell, I'm so sorry about your mailbox. These delivery drivers at night, they're just not used to our rural roads out here. The lighting is so poor and they drive so fast trying to make their quotas. Maybe you should consider getting something more substantial next time." The way she said substantial made it sound like she was talking about a sick animal that needed to be put out of its misery. I looked up at her perfect white teeth and her perfectly manicured nails wrapped around that green smoothie that probably cost $15 at some boutique health food store in Scottsdale, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was responsible for this destruction. But knowing something and proving it are two entirely different things, especially when you're dealing with someone who's made a career out of making everything look perfect on the surface while hiding the ugliness underneath. so I just nodded and said, "You're probably right, Paige. I'll build something stronger this time." Her smile got even wider at that response, like she'd just won some kind of contest that I didn't know we were playing. She took a sip of her smoothie and said, "I'm so glad you're taking this positively, Russell. Change can be difficult, but it's usually for the best." As she walked back toward her pristine colonial house with its perfect lawn and color-coordinated flower beds, I made myself a promise while I held the broken pieces of Melissa's handiwork in my desert-calloused hands. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If Paige Whitlow wanted to play games with the last connection I had to my wife, she was about to learn that this old cowboy still had some fight left in him. I thought a thick oak mailbox would be safe from whatever psychotic tendencies were driving Paige's midnight destruction sprees. Boy, was I wrong about that assumption. I spent the next 5 days in my garage, working with the same red oak lumber that Melissa and I had used for the drive-in's original concession stand back when we were young and broke and convinced that hard work and good intentions were enough to build a successful business. The desert heat made the garage feel like a blast furnace, even with both doors open and 3 different fans running. But I didn't mind the discomfort. The physical work kept my hands busy and my mind focused on something other than how empty the house felt, without Melissa's voice calling me in for lunch or asking if I needed help with whatever project I was wrestling with. This time, I made the mailbox 3 inches thick instead of the original 1-inch boards, using mortise and tenon joints that would have made a 19th century furniture maker proud. Each carved letter wasn't just a name. It was defiance in wood form. The red paint I used was the same color Melissa had mixed for the original sign, and I applied it in thin, careful coats that built up slowly over several days, just like she'd taught me when we were refinishing the concession stand serving counter. The concrete foundation I poured went down 3 feet deep and spread out 2 feet in every direction, anchored with enough rebar to support a small building. But I also did something else that I didn't tell anyone about, something that would prove crucial in the coming weeks. I installed one of the old security cameras from the drive-in's projection booth, hidden inside a realistic-looking fake saguaro cactus that I positioned about 20 feet away from the mailbox, left over from the drive-in, solar-powered, and ready to catch ghosts in BMWs. 3 days after I finished the installation, Paige showed up at my front door carrying a thick 3-ring binder labeled Dustwood Ranch Estates Community Standards and Aesthetic Guidelines, and wearing that same predatory smile she'd displayed while watching me clean up the wreckage of my first mailbox. She was dressed like she was heading to a Fortune 500 board meeting instead of harassing a neighbor on a Tuesday afternoon. Sharp business suit, expensive briefcase, hair styled in a way that probably required $200 and 3 hours at some exclusive Scottsdale salon. "Russell, I hate to be the bearer of unwelcome news, but your new mailbox appears to violate several important community standards that we've established to maintain property values and aesthetic consistency throughout Dustwood Ranch." She opened the binder to reveal page after page of approved mailbox designs, every single one a generic white or beige plastic monument to suburban conformity. The photographs looked like they'd been taken at a Home Depot clearance sale, rows of identical mailboxes that could have been installed in any planned community from Phoenix to San Diego, without anyone noticing the difference. As you can see, we've carefully selected designs that complement the desert modern aesthetic that makes our community so desirable to potential buyers. Your mailbox, while obviously crafted with considerable skill, is simply too dark and rustic for the sophisticated image we're trying to project. She flipped to another page that showed color charts and material specifications, talking about visual harmony and cohesive community branding, like she was discussing a marketing campaign instead of a place where people actually lived their lives. I looked at her standing there in my doorway, blocking out the Arizona sun with her perfectly pressed suit and her artificially whitened teeth, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, but a deeper kind of resistance that came from years of fighting for every small victory in a world that seemed designed to crush individual expression. This wasn't just about mailboxes or HOA rules or community standards. This was about the systematic erasure of everything that made this place unique, everything that connected it to the land and the history and the people who had been here before the developers showed up with their focus groups and market research. "Paige, this is Arizona, not some suburban shopping mall in Connecticut. That mailbox represents 15 years of my life with Melissa, and it's been standing in that exact spot since before your house was even built." I pulled out my copy of the original HOA covenant. the one I'd signed when I reluctantly agreed to let my property be included in the new development. I've read through this document several times, and I don't see any specific regulations about mailbox colors or materials, just general language about maintaining property values. Her smile got tighter, and her voice took on an edge that reminded me of fingernails scraping across a chalkboard. Russell, you're going to regret taking that attitude with me. I've been working very hard to improve this community, and I won't let one stubborn resident undermine everything we've accomplished. This is your first and only warning. Either you comply with community standards voluntarily, or we'll find other ways to ensure your cooperation. That night at exactly 1:45 in the morning, my hidden camera captured something that made my blood run cold and my hands shake with rage. Paige's silver BMW SUV came rolling down the dirt road with its headlights turned off, moving slow and deliberate like a predator stalking prey through the desert darkness. When she got within 50 feet of my mailbox, she turned on her high beams, illuminating the target like a stage spotlight, then gunned the engine and drove straight into it at approximately 25 miles per hour. The sound of the impact echoed across the desert like a rifle shot, sharp and violent in the pre-dawn silence. I watched through the camera feed as she climbed out of the SUV to inspect the damage, her designer pajamas incongruous in the harsh desert landscape. The oak had held up better than she'd expected. There was a significant crack running down one side, and the concrete foundation had shifted slightly. But the mailbox was still upright and functional. She walked around it twice, kicked at the base with her expensive slippers, and said something I couldn't hear from the camera's audio pickup. Then she got back in her SUV and drove away, leaving behind a cracked headlight housing and a chunk of her front bumper embedded in the oak. The next morning, I called the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department to report vandalism and destruction of property. I had high-definition video evidence, I had physical evidence in the form of BMW parts scattered around my mailbox, and I had a clear motive in Paige's documented harassment about community standards. What I didn't expect was for Deputy Troy Danner to show up at my door instead of a detective or a regular patrol officer. Troy was a local guy, born and raised in Arizona, the kind of small-town cop who knew everybody in the county and whose family had been here for 3 generations. He'd been coming to our drive-in since he was a teenager, back when he was dating the homecoming queen and trying to decide between joining the military or going to community college. Melissa always remembered his order: large popcorn, 2 Cokes, and extra butter. And she'd ask about his family and his job, and treat him like the son we'd never had. I'd always considered Troy a friend, or at least a friendly acquaintance, so I was completely unprepared for his reaction when I showed him the video evidence on my laptop computer. Russell, I can see why you'd be upset about this situation, but I have to tell you that the video isn't as conclusive as you might think it is. The image quality makes it difficult to identify the driver, and the lighting conditions could make it appear that the impact was more deliberate than it actually was. He was standing in my kitchen, sweating through his uniform despite the air conditioning, looking everywhere except at the laptop screen where Paige was clearly and obviously ramming her BMW into my property with malicious intent. Paige Whitlow is a respected member of this community, Russell. She's organized neighborhood watch programs, coordinated emergency response protocols with the fire department, and donated thousands of dollars to local charities since she moved here from California. I just can't see her doing something like this deliberately, especially over something as minor as a mailbox dispute. That's when I realized that this wasn't going to be the straightforward criminal investigation I'd expected. This was going to be something much more complicated and much more dangerous. When Deputy Troy watched my crystal clear video evidence and said it was probably just an unfortunate accident, I knew I wasn't just dealing with desert rattlesnakes anymore. I was up against something much more venomous. Troy wouldn't look at the screen. He'd already made up his mind. I could see something in his pale blue eyes that I recognized from my years running the drive-in. The look of a man who's already decided which side of the story he wants to believe and doesn't want to be confused by inconvenient facts. He'd aged considerably since his teenage years, developed the soft gut and tired expression that comes from 20 years of small-town police work, dealing with domestic disputes and drunk drivers and petty theft cases that never seemed to make much difference in the grand scheme of things. Russell, you gotta understand the position I'm in here. Paige Whitlow has been nothing but a model citizen since she moved to Dustwood Ranch 3 years ago. She's single-handedly transformed this community from a collection of random houses into a real neighborhood with standards and pride. He gestured vaguely toward the laptop screen, where the video clearly showed Paige's BMW accelerating into my mailbox with obvious premeditation and malicious intent. He listed her resume like a proud dad: charity, barbecues, county meetings. None of it changed the video. This video footage, well, it's pretty grainy when you really look at it closely, and the timestamp could be wrong, and you can't actually see the driver's face clearly enough to make a positive identification in a court of law. Could have been anyone driving that BMW. Maybe someone borrowed it. Maybe it was stolen. Maybe the whole thing is just an unfortunate misunderstanding between neighbors who need to learn how to communicate better. He closed the laptop without reviewing the footage a second time, dismissing months of harassment and property damage with the casual indifference of someone who'd already decided which side of the conflict deserved his protection. But then something strange happened that revealed the true nature of what I was dealing with. Troy's whole demeanor shifted when he walked outside and saw my replacement mailbox standing there in the morning sunlight, solid and defiant and completely unashamed of its refusal to conform to Paige's suburban aesthetic standards. Suddenly he was very interested in measuring distances and checking sight lines and making detailed notes in his little citation book, approaching my mailbox like a building inspector looking for code violations. Now, Russell, I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but it looks like your mailbox might be positioned in violation of Arizona Department of Transportation regulations regarding roadway clearances and sightline obstructions. He pulled out a metal tape measure and made an elaborate show of measuring the distance from my mailbox to the edge of the asphalt, writing down numbers and shaking his head like he'd discovered evidence of a serious public safety hazard. According to state law, mailboxes have to be positioned at least 24 inches from the edge of the pavement to ensure adequate clearance for emergency vehicles and snow removal equipment. I almost laughed at the snow removal part. We hadn't seen snow in Dustwood Ranch since the Eisenhower administration. But Troy was completely serious as he recorded measurements and calculated angles, and generally made it clear that my mailbox represented a clear and present danger to public safety. This mailbox appears to be positioned approximately 23 inches from the pavement edge, which constitutes a violation of state traffic safety regulations. I'm going to have to issue you a citation for improper placement of roadside infrastructure. The fine was $350 with an additional requirement that I move the mailbox back at least 2 feet within 7 days or face additional penalties. Troy handed me the citation with the satisfied expression of a man who just solved a difficult problem through the proper application of bureaucratic authority. I'd strongly recommend that you work with Paige on resolving these community issues, Russell. She's not your enemy, she's just trying to keep the neighborhood safe and attractive for everyone who lives here. You're relatively new to the whole HOA situation, so maybe you should take some time to learn how these things work before you start making serious accusations against your neighbors. That's when I started paying very close attention to Deputy Troy Danner's daily routine and his relationship with the self-appointed Queen of Dustwood Ranch Estates. Over the next week, I noticed his patrol car parked outside Paige's house during his lunch breaks, positioned in her driveway like he was conducting official business, but staying for 45 minutes or an hour at a time. I saw them talking on her front porch in the late afternoon heat, him with his hat off and his shirt sleeves rolled up, her bringing out glasses of iced tea and homemade cookies like they were old friends catching up on neighborhood gossip. I watched from my kitchen window as they laughed together while she showed him something on her phone. Probably photographs of other mailboxes or landscaping violations or whatever other community infractions she'd discovered during her daily patrol of the neighborhood. They stood close together, heads almost touching as they reviewed her evidence, and I realized that Troy wasn't just biased in Paige's favor. He was actively collaborating with her to make life miserable for anyone who refused to conform to her vision of suburban perfection. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I wasn't fighting a fair fight against one difficult neighbor. I was up against a conspiracy that included local law enforcement, a systematic campaign to force me out of my own community through harassment and legal intimidation. Troy had probably been listening to Paige's complaints about my non-conforming house and my inappropriate mailbox for months before she decided to escalate to direct action. He'd been primed to see me as the troublemaker, the outsider, who didn't understand how things worked in their perfect little planned community. I spent that evening sitting on my front porch, watching the sun set behind the Superstition Mountains and thinking about what Melissa would have done in this situation. She'd always been the diplomatic one, but also fierce when it came to protecting what was ours. Fight smart, not stupid, she used to say. That's when I went into the garage and started looking through the boxes of equipment left over from the drive-in. Sound systems, projection equipment, motion sensors, timers, all the technological pieces of a business that had entertained thousands of families under the Arizona stars. And that's when I got an idea that would change everything. An idea that combined old-fashioned desert ingenuity with 21st century technology and a lifetime of experience in the entertainment business. If Paige and Troy wanted to play games with legal technicalities and bureaucratic harassment, I was going to give them a show they'd never forget. Paige Whitlow and Deputy Troy Danner thought they were clever, ganging up on one old cowboy with their legal citations and their coordinated harassment campaign. They hadn't seen what an angry Arizona rancher with a garage full of drive-in theater equipment and 30 years of desert survival experience could accomplish when properly motivated. I spent the next 2 weeks designing and building what I privately called the Fortress Mailbox, a project that combined everything I'd learned about structural engineering from maintaining outdoor movie equipment with a healthy dose of pure spite and determination. The exterior would look exactly like those boring white plastic mailboxes that Paige was so obsessed with. Generic, inoffensive, suburban, perfect in every measurable way. But underneath that innocuous shell would be a steel framework built from the same heavy-gauge tubing we'd used for the drive-in's 40-foot movie screen supports, anchored to a concrete foundation that would make the Hoover Dam look like a child's sandcastle. The engineering was actually pretty straightforward once I got into the technical details. The steel frame would be designed to absorb and distribute impact forces across the entire structure, while the concrete foundation would provide an immovable anchor point that could withstand everything from flash floods to earthquake tremors. I salvaged the steel tubing from the drive-in's dismantled infrastructure, cutting it into precise lengths and welding the joints with the same equipment I'd used to maintain our projection booth and concession stand for 15 years. Working in the garage brought back a flood of memories from the early days of our business, when Melissa and I would spend entire weekends fabricating custom solutions for problems that didn't have off-the-shelf answers. She'd always been my best assistant, holding flashlights and fetching tools, and offering suggestions that usually turned out to be more practical than my original ideas. "Russell," she'd say, watching me struggle with some impossible welding angle, "why don't you try approaching it from the other side?" And 9 times out of 10, she'd be absolutely right. The concrete foundation required a permit from the county, which meant dealing with a building inspector who couldn't understand why anyone would need a 4-foot-deep, 4-foot-wide concrete pad for something as simple as a mailbox. I explained that the desert soil conditions required special anchoring for wind resistance, and the monsoon rains could undermine anything that wasn't properly engineered for local conditions. After 3 inspections and a headache's worth of engineering drawings, I got the green light for what was officially classified as a decorative landscape foundation, rather than mailbox infrastructure. The steel frame, built from salvaged tubing from our old drive-in screens, was engineered to absorb impact like a truck bumper. I welded every joint with precision, designed to look flimsy, built to stop a tank. The framework had crumple zones and energy absorption features that would protect the mailbox while transferring destructive forces safely into the concrete foundation. But the real genius of the design was in the camouflage. The plastic shell that covered the steel framework was attached with breakaway fasteners that would allow the outer layer to separate cleanly in the event of a collision, revealing the true nature of what lay underneath. From the road, it would look exactly like every other boring suburban mailbox in every other planned community in America. White plastic, regulation size, completely forgettable. But I knew what was really hiding under that unremarkable exterior. The installation had to be done at night to avoid Paige's constant surveillance of my activities. I rented a small excavator to dig the foundation hole, working by the light of portable floodlights that I'd borrowed from a neighbor who did construction work. Took 6 yards of stubbornness and a truck that barely fit the road. The whole operation was completed between midnight and 5 in the morning, with the evidence carefully hidden under a layer of decorative gravel and native desert plants. Paige noticed the change immediately, of course. She made a point of walking by the next morning during her usual power walk routine, slowing down to inspect my handiwork like a general reviewing troops before battle. She even stopped to take photographs with her expensive phone, probably documenting my compliance with community standards for her HOA. The mailbox looked exactly like the generic suburban models she'd been demanding, white plastic with regulation lettering and proper setback from the roadway. When she saw me working in the yard later that morning, she came over with her biggest, most triumphant smile yet, radiating the satisfaction of someone who just won a significant victory through persistence and superior strategy. Russell, I'm absolutely delighted to see that you've decided to work with the community standards instead of fighting them. This new mailbox looks so much more appropriate for our neighborhood aesthetic. I just knew you'd come around once you understood what we're trying to accomplish here in Dustwood Ranch. She gestured toward the innocuous white box like she was showing off a prize-winning garden. Cooperation is so much more pleasant than conflict, don't you think? I just nodded and said, "You're absolutely right, Paige. I should have listened to you from the beginning. All I want is to get along with my neighbors and be a contributing member of this community." She practically glowed with satisfaction at my apparent capitulation, probably already planning her next target for aesthetic improvement. What she didn't know was that she was about to provide the ultimate field test for my engineering skills. That night at 2:15 in the morning, Paige decided to celebrate her victory by giving my new mailbox the definitive proof that I'd learned my lesson about community compliance. My hidden camera captured her silver BMW approaching with deliberate intent, headlights blazing like some kind of suburban Death Star. She'd upgraded to a larger SUV since her last encounter with my property, probably figuring that more mass and horsepower would solve any problems she might encounter with stubborn mailboxes. The impact was absolutely spectacular. Paige hit my disguised fortress at approximately 35 miles per hour, with enough force to trigger every safety system in her vehicle and send a shockwave that rattled windows 3 houses away. The mailbox didn't move so much as a quarter inch. The plastic shell cracked but held its position, and the steel frame absorbed the impact like it was designed to stop runaway freight trains. But her BMW looked like it had collided with a concrete wall, which technically it had. The front end was completely destroyed. Hood buckled, headlights shattered, radiator ruptured, airbags deployed throughout the passenger compartment. Steam poured from the engine bay while various fluids leaked onto the desert dirt, creating a toxic rainbow in the reflected light from the one remaining headlight. I could see Paige struggling to get out of the driver's seat, her perfect blonde hair now disheveled with airbag powder, her expensive pajamas torn and dirty from the violence of the collision. She stood there in the desert darkness, staring at my completely undamaged mailbox with an expression of absolute disbelief that was probably visible from space. I ran outside in my bathrobe, playing the role of the concerned neighbor with Academy Award-worthy conviction. "Paige, oh my God, what happened? Are you hurt? Should I call 911? She was shaking with shock and rage, looking back and forth between her destroyed vehicle and my pristine mailbox like she couldn't process what had just occurred. "I don't understand. It was just a mailbox. How could—" I thought I'd won the war with my fortress mailbox and Paige's spectacular collision with Arizona engineering, but she had one more weapon in her arsenal that she'd learned during her years in California, and it almost destroyed everything I'd worked to protect. The morning after her midnight encounter with my disguised fortress, Paige was on the phone with a Phoenix law firm that specialized in personal injury litigation and property damage cases. By noon, she'd retained an attorney named Marcus Steinberg, who had built his reputation on turning minor accidents into major settlements through creative interpretation of liability laws and aggressive negotiation tactics. Within 48 hours of the collision, I was served with a lawsuit that claimed damages in excess of $100,000. The legal paperwork was a masterpiece of creative writing that would have impressed the faculty of any law school in the country. According to Paige's complaint, I had willfully and maliciously constructed a concealed hazardous structure designed to cause maximum damage to vehicles while maintaining the deceptive appearance of standard residential infrastructure. The lawsuit alleged that I had violated Arizona traffic safety statutes, community covenants, and basic principles of neighborly conduct by creating what they termed an attractive nuisance disguised as routine suburban amenity. The most damaging allegation was that I had intentionally engineered the mailbox structure to cause severe vehicular damage and personal injury while appearing to comply with community standards, which made me sound like some kind of criminal mastermind who spent his retirement years designing elaborate traps for unsuspecting neighbors. They claimed that my actions constituted assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and fraud, seeking punitive damages that would have bankrupted me and forced me to sell the house that contained my last memories of life with Melissa. 3 days after I was served with the legal papers, Paige called an emergency meeting of the Dustwood Ranch Estates Homeowners Association, sending official notices to all 23 households in our development. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the community center, with an agenda that included discussion of dangerous and deceptive infrastructure and community safety measures. I arrived at the community center to find that Paige had prepared a presentation worthy of a Netflix villain giving a TED Talk. She'd created a PowerPoint slideshow with professional graphics and dramatic photographs of her destroyed BMW, complete with detailed diagrams showing how my concealed steel structure had caused catastrophic vehicle damage and traumatic personal injury. The presentation included quotes from engineering experts and legal precedents that made my mailbox look like a medieval siege weapon disguised as suburban infrastructure. Her performance was worthy of an Academy Award for Best Actress in a Dramatic Role. She talked about feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood, about the precedent that my booby trap would set for other residents, about the potential liability that the entire community could face if my deceptive construction injured someone else. She showed photographs of her injuries, minor bruises and scrapes, that she'd photographed from dramatic angles to make them look as severe as possible. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not just talking about a mailbox here," she said, clicking through slides that showed my innocent-looking white plastic mailbox from various angles. "We're talking about a deliberate attempt to harm members of our community while hiding behind the pretense of compliance with our aesthetic standards. Russell Gaines has weaponized suburban infrastructure, turning something as innocent as a mailbox into a dangerous trap." When it came time for the vote, the results were devastating and completely predictable. 7 households voted to require immediate removal of my dangerous structure. 0 households voted in opposition, and 15 households abstained because they were too frightened of getting involved in what had obviously become a bitter legal battle between neighbors. The abstentions were almost worse than the opposition votes. They represented neighbors who might have supported me if they hadn't been terrified of becoming Paige's next targets. I was given 48 hours to replace my mailbox with an approved model from Paige's catalog of suburban conformity, or face fines of $2,000 per day plus legal action to force compliance. The HOA board also voted to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection of my entire property, which was essentially a threat to find additional violations that could be used to drive me out of the community entirely. Even Troy tried to reason with me. "She's not a bad person," he said, again. I stopped listening after the second time. He stood on my front porch with his hat in his hands, looking for all the world like a man who was genuinely trying to help an old friend navigate a difficult situation. "Russell, this situation with Paige has gotten completely out of hand and I'm worried about where it's heading. You've crossed a line here. You've created something that could seriously hurt someone, and you've done it deliberately to make a point about property rights or whatever principle you think you're defending." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt something that I hadn't experienced since Melissa's funeral. Complete and total despair. I sat on my front porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains where we'd planned to grow old together, and I wondered if maybe it was time to admit defeat. Maybe I was just a stubborn old man, fighting a battle that didn't matter anymore, tilting at windmills while the world moved on without me. I held Melissa's photograph in my weathered hands and asked her what she would do in this situation. Would she fight or would she compromise? Would she care more about being right or being able to live peacefully in the place we'd chosen for our retirement? The desert wind carried the familiar scents of sage and creosote and desert ironwood, the same smells that had surrounded us during our first kiss, our wedding day, the morning we decided to buy this land and build our dreams on it. But then I remembered something Melissa used to say during the difficult early years of the drive-in. Sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of the game. That's when I went into the garage and started pulling out boxes of equipment that hadn't been used since the drive-in closed its doors for the final time. Sound systems, recording equipment, motion sensors, timers, speakers, all the technological remnants of a business that had brought joy and wonder to thousands of families under the vast Arizona sky. And that's when I conceived an idea that would transform this entire conflict in ways that neither Paige nor Troy could possibly anticipate. Paige Whitlow thought she'd won the war with her lawyers and her lawsuits and her carefully orchestrated community pressure campaign. She had absolutely no idea what an old cowboy with a garage full of drive-in theater equipment and a lifetime of desert survival skills could accomplish when he stopped playing defense and decided to go on the offensive. The plan came to me all at once, like the best ideas always do, elegant, simple, and completely unexpected. Instead of building a mailbox that could withstand physical attacks, I would create one that could fight back with words and witnesses, and the devastating power of public humiliation. Using the sound system and recording equipment from our old drive-in theater, I could build a mailbox that would document every attack and broadcast the results to anyone who cared to watch the show. I cobbled together a Frankenstein mailbox, part surveillance drone, part drive-in announcer, all vengeance. I spent 4 days in the garage, connecting speakers to motion sensors and linking everything to a recording system that I could control remotely from my smartphone. The speakers were small enough to hide inside the mailbox post, camouflaged behind fake rocks that looked like natural desert landscapes. But the real genius of the system was in the pre-recorded messages that I spent an entire afternoon creating in the garage, using the same voice skills I developed for drive-in announcements. I recorded dozens of different responses. "Good evening, Paige. Welcome back to the show. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a repeat performance from our favorite California transplant. And try hitting it harder this time. The last few attempts weren't quite strong enough." The most important part of my plan was the performance I gave for Paige and the rest of the Dustwood Ranch community. I made an elaborate show of capitulating to the HOA demands, sending a written letter to every household acknowledging that I had been inappropriate and inconsiderate. I promised to replace my dangerous mailbox with something that was safe, appropriate, and fully compliant with community standards within 1 week. Paige was so pleased with my apparent surrender that she actually volunteered to supervise the installation of my replacement mailbox, standing in my driveway with her arms crossed and that familiar, predatory smile. She inspected every component of the new installation, running her perfectly manicured hands along the surface to ensure there were no hidden steel reinforcements, even kicking the base gently to confirm that it was appropriately fragile and suburban. That night, Paige decided to test my new cooperative attitude with what she probably thought was a subtle reminder of who held the real power. As soon as her headlights appeared in the motion sensor's detection range, my mailbox cheerfully announced, "Good evening, Paige. I've been waiting for you to come back." She slammed on her brakes so hard that her tires squealed against the asphalt, frantically looking around to figure out where my voice was coming from. But the real magic happened 3 nights later, when Paige decided that my talking mailbox was just another obstacle to be overcome. She thought she was sneaking up on a mailbox. Turns out, the mailbox was waiting for her. What she didn't know was that from the moment her SUV came within 50 feet of my mailbox, she was already broadcasting live to 23 neighbors who had signed up for notifications. The show that followed was better than anything we'd ever screened at the drive-in. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's main feature," my mailbox announced as Paige's BMW accelerated toward its target. The collision was spectacular. Paige hit the concealed steel frame with enough force to deploy every airbag in her vehicle, but my mailbox didn't just survive, it provided running commentary throughout the entire disaster. Ooh, that's gonna leave a mark. But wait, folks, there's more entertainment to come. 23 neighbors watched in real time as Paige stumbled out of her destroyed BMW and began attacking my mailbox with her bare hands, screaming obscenities while my mailbox calmly observed. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears that our featured performer is having some difficulty accepting the evening's final score." The video went viral before Paige could even get her insurance company on the phone. By sunrise, HOA Queen vs. Talking Mailbox had been viewed over 20,000 times and shared across social media platforms throughout Arizona and beyond. When the video of Paige's final battle with my talking mailbox reached 75,000 views and got picked up by national news networks, I knew the war was finally over, and justice had prevailed in the most satisfying way possible. The power of viral video in the 21st century is something that I never fully understood until I watched it work in my favor, with devastating effectiveness. Within 72 hours of Paige's spectacular defeat, my story had been featured on news programs from Phoenix to New York City, shared on social media accounts from coast to coast, and turned into a cautionary tale about HOA overreach that resonated with people who had never heard of Dustwood Ranch estates but understood the universal appeal of watching a bully get exactly what they deserved. But the real breakthrough came when the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department assigned a new investigator to review all the vandalism complaints that had been filed over the previous 6 months. Detective Sarah Martinez was a 20-year veteran of the department who specialized in harassment cases and domestic disputes, and she wasn't interested in maintaining neighborhood harmony at the expense of actual law enforcement. She arrived at my house with a laptop computer, a digital recorder, and a professional skepticism about Deputy Troy's handling of the original complaints. Mr. Gaines, we've reviewed all the video evidence that's been circulating online, and we've also received multiple witness statements from neighbors who observed the incidents in question over the past several months, she said, settling into a chair at my kitchen table like she was conducting a serious criminal investigation instead of a neighborhood dispute. This appears to be a clear-cut case of criminal vandalism, harassment, and possibly stalking, depending on how the district attorney's office wants to proceed with prosecution. The investigation revealed that Deputy Troy had been systematically dismissing or ignoring complaints about Paige's behavior for almost a year, not just from me but from several other residents who had encountered her increasingly aggressive enforcement of community standards. Troy had ignored or actively discouraged every complaint, apparently convinced that maintaining Paige's vision of community harmony was more important than protecting residents from harassment and discrimination. The final HOA meeting was like something from a Frank Capra movie, with the entire community packed into our little meeting room while Paige sat alone at the head table, looking for all the world like a defendant waiting for a jury to deliver a verdict. The video evidence was undeniable, the witness testimony was overwhelming, and the legal liability was crystal clear. The vote to remove Paige from the HOA board wasn't even close. 22 votes for immediate removal, 0 votes in opposition, with Paige unable to vote because she was no longer considered a member in good standing due to her pending criminal charges. But removing Paige from power was just the beginning of the transformation that swept through Dustwood Ranch Estates over the following months. The new HOA leadership, with me serving as a very reluctant president, immediately voted to rescind all of the aesthetic restrictions that had been used to harass non-conforming residents. We established a community fund to help neighbors install creative and personalized mailboxes that reflected their individual personalities, instead of some corporate marketing consultant's idea of suburban uniformity. The talking mailbox became something of a local celebrity, featured in newspaper articles and television news reports as an example of creative problem-solving and community activism. But more importantly, it became the centerpiece of a real neighborhood, a place where people knew each other's names, helped each other with problems, and celebrated the diversity that made our community stronger, instead of trying to eliminate it through fear and conformity. Paige sold her house and moved back to California within 4 months of her final encounter with Arizona engineering, unable to cope with being a laughingstock in a community where she had once wielded absolute power. Deputy Troy was transferred to a different district and required to complete additional training on community policing, bias recognition, and the constitutional rights of citizens who don't conform to their neighbors' expectations. As for me, I finally felt like Melissa would have been proud of what I had accomplished. Not just the technical achievement of building a mailbox that could defend itself against suburban tyranny, but the more important victory of refusing to let fear and conformity erase the last traces of the wild, independent spirit that had brought us to this desert in the first place. The red letters spelling Gaines Drive-In Forever were once again displayed prominently on a wooden sign right next to my mailbox, and underneath, in Melissa's careful handwriting, the words that summed up everything we'd learned from this experience. In memory of Melissa Gaines, who loved wild things and wild places. 6 months later, a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles reached out about the talking mailbox story. The Mailbox That Fought Back premiered at Sundance, won the Audience Award, and eventually reached millions of viewers on streaming services who understood the universal appeal of standing up to bullies hiding behind community standards. And that's how I turned a simple mailbox into a secret weapon that defeated the most vicious HOA tyrant in Arizona history. Paige Whitlow thought she was clever when she brought her California-style neighborhood control to our desert community, but she forgot one crucial thing about us Arizona folks. We don't just survive in the desert, we thrive here. We've got long memories for people who think they can push us around, and we've got the ingenuity to turn their own weapons against them when they cross the line from neighbor to enemy. Every time some new HOA dictator thinks they can bully their neighbors into submission, I hope they remember this story and think twice before messing with people who know how to make mailboxes talk back.